pleasure to introduce our two presenters today. I believe Aaron Saunders is going to do most of the presentation, but we're also lucky to have Carol Chambers along as well to answer some questions and provide some feedback. Erin recently completed her Bachelor's of Science in Forestry at Northern Arizona University in 2009, and even more recently completed her Master's of Science in Forestry just this past May. So congratulations to her on that. And she's currently working for the U.S. Forest Service in Colorado Springs as a wildlife technician. And as I mentioned to her, it's nice to keep talented people close to home. Colorado isn't too far away, and so I'm glad she's working there. Carol Chambers, probably most of you know, she received her Bachelor's of Science in Biology and Master's of Science in Forestry, University of Kentucky. She then went on to get a PhD in Wildlife Sciences from Oregon State University. And she's now a professor of wildlife ecology at Northern Arizona University. So she has a geographically broad experience. And her research tends to focus in on wildlife habitat relationships, particularly small mammals and birds. And she's a member of the Wildlife Society since 1992 and is currently the Southwest Section representative to the Wildlife Society Council. And so again, I'm very pleased to have both of them here today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron. Aaron, let me just give you controls within the webinar system. Okay, and you should now have the floor and be able to take it away. Thank you, Aaron.
All right, let's see if this works. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Since Xander went ahead and introduced Carol and I, I'll just go ahead and jump forward here to our outline. This is some of the main points that I'll be talking about today. The main thing I want to point out, let's see if I can make this work, is that there's three parts to this study that you'll see: bat activity, bat captures, and roosting habitat. So we'll go ahead and jump into just some basic background information. So why are bats important to our environment? A major service that they provide that most of you probably know is pest control. And there's a great example of this regarding the Mexican free-tailed bat that has been estimated to save cotton farmers in south-central Texas about $740,000 annually in reduced pesticide use. Bats are also great pollinators and seed dispersers, a number of commercial products that probably most of you eat and or use. And so because bats provide really important ecological and economic services, we were interested in two main questions. Our first was to describe the bat assemblage by assessing the bat activity via echolocation and bat captures via mist netting. And our second objective was to describe landscape and microsite level roosting habitat by assessing the roosting habitat via radio telemetry. So to assess bat activity, we can use a bat's echolocation call. And so this is an ultrasonic pulse that allows a bat to navigate through the landscape and to detect prey. We can also use this to identify a bat called a species, or we can just put it into a broad group such as a high or low frequency bat. So bats that echolocate at a high frequency have much shorter calls, which provides a lot of information quickly back to the bat, so they can generally live in a much more cluttered environment. Conversely, bats that echolocate at a lower frequency have much longer calls, which provides information back to the bat that is much farther away. And so they can generally live in a much more open environment. We can also look at a bat's wing structure in coordination with echolocation to make predictions about where a bat might be found on the landscape. So bats in the lower left-hand corner have a short, stubby wing and with a high frequency call, which means they can navigate throughout a cluttered landscape. So think more of a biplane. Now bats in the upper right-hand corner have much longer and narrower wings with a low frequency call, which means they can fly long distances in open areas. So think more of a Boeing 747. So to assess bat captures, we can capture bats via mist nets because bats will drink and feed while in flight. In the Southwest, water is fairly scarce and scattered, so we can usually place mist nets over man-made or some water catchments. And then to assess roosting habitat, we can attach radio transmitters to bats and track them back to their roost. And so during maternity season, when female bats are pregnant, females will aggregate in these large groups. And this picture shows a maternity colony, and those little pink ones are actually the bat pups. And so this grouping behavior can greatly affect the temperature and humidity of a roost, which increases reproductive success and survival of young, and conserves water by reducing evaporative water loss. And females can use a variety of substrates for roosts, but this project we specifically focused on snag roosts. So of the 28 species that occur in Arizona, 16 use Ponderosa pine forest habitat. And of those, 6 species are known to use exfoliating bark or cracks in trees or snags as maternity roosts. The 6 bat species that use snag roosts are shown here. 4 of them are Myotis species. 1 is the big brown bat, and the last is the Allen's lapid-browed bat, which is a sensitive species under the U.S. Forest Service. So we were specifically interested in how wildfire affected snag roosting bats in the Southwest due to this trend over the last 100 years in the size of wildfires in Arizona and New Mexico. In the last 20 years, there's been a substantial increase in the number of acres burned. And in 2011, there were over 2.2 million acres burned, which is bigger than the largest national forest in Arizona. And then when we looked at what research had already been conducted on bats and wildfire, we found there were only 3. There was 1 in Idaho, 1 in California, and 1 in Australia. And all 3 of these only utilized echolocation to assess bat activity. And the remaining studies all looked specifically at prescribed fire instead of wildfire. So looking back at our first objective, we have 2 main hypotheses in relation to bat activity via echolocation. We hypothesized that in the low burn severity areas, we would find higher activity of bats with high frequency calls that are adapted to clutter. And then in areas of high burn severity, we would find higher activity of bats with low frequency calls that are adapted to open areas. So still looking at our first objective, but more specifically at bat captures via mist netting, we had hypothesized that water surrounded by low burn severity would have a much more complex bat assemblage. And then conversely, water surrounded by high burn severity would have a less complex bat assemblage. And for objective 2, when looking at roosting habitat via radio telemetry, we had hypothesized that maternity roosts would be in low burn severity areas with large unburned snags and a high snag density. So let's look a little bit more at where this study actually took place. So the Wallow Fire burned in 2011. It was just under 500,000 acres. It burned in eastern Arizona. And for this study, we focused specifically within the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. We used the RAVG database, which uses immediate basal area loss to determine fire severity. And so the green areas shown on the map represent areas that had a lower basal area loss and thus a lower burn severity. And then the other extreme are the dark purple areas that had a high basal area loss and thus a high burn severity. And then there's 2 categories in the middle that are more of a moderate burn severity. So I'll first start with the methods for assessing bat activity. And as a quick aside, this picture shows a microphone setup for acoustic recording devices we used. So to assess bat activity, we randomly sampled points from June to August in 2014. These are the white squares only. And so we had 21 blocks, each with 4 points that represented 1 of the 4 burn severities. And we blocked them this way to eliminate other environmental factors such as wind, temperature, moon phase, or other things that could change daily. Additional criteria were used to avoid areas with potentially high activity. Next are the methods for the bat captures. And so to assess bat captures, we randomly sampled water sites from June to early July in both 2013 and 2014. And these are the blue circles on the map. And so for each of those, we took a 0.6-mile radius around each water site and calculated the amount of burn severity, then put either of those into a lower high burn severity classification. And then at each water site, we collected a variety of variables to describe the environment. We then captured the bats, took physical measurements, and then released them as quickly as possible. Lastly are the methods for roosting habitat. So to assess roosting habitat, we radio tagged reproductive female bats of 6 focal species. We tracked each bat back to its roost via a variety of telemetry techniques, and then we also conducted exit counts to confirm that the roost snag was in fact the roost. And for each roost located, we measured each of these variables listed here. Our main fire variable was the amount of burn on the bowl of the snag. And so to measure this, we took the height of the snag as well as the height of the burn using a kilometer and then just took a percent. And so for example, the snag here on the left would have been approximately 10% burned, where the snag here on the right would have been more about 100% burned. Next, we set up 5 37-foot radius plots, 1 around the roost snag and then 4 in each of the cardinal directions at random distances. And then again, each of these listed measurements were also taken. So all those previous vegetation measurements were taken for both the roost snag as well as a randomly selected comparison snag that was presumed unused. And then we used GIS to assess the amount of burn severity surrounding each snag at 2 different scales, one at 328 feet and then the other at 1,640 feet radius to see if either of those scales affected roost selection. So we used a variety of statistical analyses, used an information theoretic approach and a multi-model inference to compare variables that predicted bat activity, bat captures, and roosting habitat. And then for bat activity and captures, I used a generalized linear mixed model framework. And for roosting habitat, I used case-control binary logistic regression models that compared the roost snag to its randomly selected comparison snag. We'll go ahead and jump into the results section now, starting with bat activity. As an aside, this picture is what a bat call looks like in Sonabat, which is an acoustic software that we use to analyze bat calls. Okay, so for the graphs in this next section, the x-axis will always be the 4 burn severities, and the y-axis will be the calls per hour for whatever group we're talking about. So in this case, high or low frequency calls per hour. And if you recall, we hypothesized that in low burn severity areas, there would be higher activity of bats with high frequency calls and adaptive clutter, and then the opposite for the high burn severity areas. So for high frequency calls, the greatest amount of activity occurred in low burn severity categories, which fit well into our hypothesis. And then for low frequency calls, the greatest amount of activity occurred in the lowest and highest burn severities. And so the activity in the high burn severity fits well with our hypothesis. Some of these bat species also roost in tree foliage, and we would speculate that's why there's also high activity in these low burn severities as well. So next, we looked at bats that fell into this lower left-hand corner that are slow and maneuverable in clutter and have a high frequency call, so those biplane bats. We had hypothesized that this group would have higher activity in low burn severity areas because they're adapted to clutter. As an aside, very few calls were detected from the Townsend's big-eared bat, so the majority of these calls were from the Myotis species. So bat activity was highest in low burn severity categories, which again fit well with our hypothesis. And then we next looked at 3 species of bats that fell into that upper right-hand corner that are fast and open air hawking and have a lower frequency call. So these were the Boeing 747 bats. We had hypothesized that this group would have higher activity in high burn severity areas because they're adapted to more open landscapes. And across all 3 species, there's a trend towards more activity in the high burn severity classes, which is similar to our hypothesis, but it's not nearly as pronounced as the other one. Next, we looked at 2 bat species that fell into the upper left-hand corner that are slower and open air flight and have low frequency calls. And we had hypothesized that this group would have higher activity in high burn severity areas because they're adapted to a more open landscape. So the big brown bat didn't fit within our hypothesis because it actually had more activity in the low burn severity areas. However, the silver-colored bat did have more activity in high burn severity, which fits well with our hypothesis. And lastly, the Allen black-browed bat is the only species in our study area that fell into the fast flight and clutter group with a low frequency call. And we had hypothesized that this group would have higher activity in low burn severity areas because it's adapted to a more cluttered landscape. And so this species had higher activity in all categories other than the highest burn severity. And so this bat does have a lower frequency call, but it's adapted to both open areas as well as cluttered areas. So our hypothesis was mostly right. Okay, so now we'll jump into the results for bat capture. So because we were interested in maternity colonies, we were limited to the bat's reproductive season, which is generally only from June to early July, so about 40 days. So given that our available window to misnet was fairly limited, I think we did well in the number of nights that we netted. We netted at least half of the available nights in both summers. And you'll notice that we sampled more water sites in low burn severity areas in 2014. And that's because that year was a bit warmer and drier, and much of the water sites in the high burn severity categories dried up before we could even utilize them. And also shown is the number of bats captured in each year, which totaled 1,441, as well as the number of reproductive females captured, which totaled 549. So relative humidity best predicted each of the listed variables. Those with a negative sign indicates that the number captured increased with a lower relative humidity. And this relationship makes sense because when there is higher humidity in the air, bats are less dependent on these centralized water sources. And to be honest, I'm not sure why the Arizona myotis and long-legged myotis capture rates are higher when relative humidity is higher. I've read in a few papers that capture rates of males are higher with higher humidity, and both of these species did have a high percentage of males caught, which might be driving this trend. And if you recall, we predicted that burn severity would affect the bat assemblage, and it obviously did not fall into any of our models since relative humidity was the only predictor. However, when we looked at, when we estimated richness for female species, burn severity was an important predictor. So for these next couple graphs, the x-axis is the number of sites, and on the y-axis is the estimated species richness for females. This first graph compares low burn severity water sites, indicated in green, with high burn severity water sites in purple, and these are 2 years post-wildfire. And we didn't see a difference in the estimated number of female species. However, when we look at 3 years post-wildfire, again, low versus high burn severity water sites, at 3 years post-wildfire, we do see a drop in the number of female species estimated from low to high burn severity areas. We then want to look more closely at what was driving the species drop within those high burn severity sites. So this graph is now looking only at sites in the high burn severity from 2 to 3 years post-wildfire. And so now we can see that there's also a drop in the estimated richness for female species from 2 to 3 years post-wildfire. So lastly are the results for the roosting habitat. Across all bat species, we ended with an 8-variable model. However, only 4 variables had an importance of greater than 0.5. And you'll also notice that our 2 fire variables, percent burn surrounding the snag, as well as the percent bulb burn, were not in our top 4 variables. So in general, we see that roost snags had a larger DVH, were more decayed, had less bark remaining, and overall more peeling bark as compared to randomly selected snags on the landscape. And as a reminder, our hypothesis for roost would be that roost would be in a lower burn severity area which burn severity was not in our top model. They would be in larger snags, which they were. And roost snags would be unburned, which they weren't. And roosts would be in areas with a high snag density, which they weren't. So these two pictures, I think, show those top 4 predictor variables really well instead of just graphs. The used roosts on the left are overall larger in diameter, have more decay, more peeling bark present, and overall less bark remaining on the snag compared to the random snags on the right. So if you remember across all species, neither the percent boll burn on the snag or the percent burn severity surrounding the snag was in our top 4 variables. This was a bit frustrating since we knew from field observations that the Arizona myotis was using less burn snags. So we decided to compare the Arizona myotis to the long-legged myotis for any differences. And we used these 2 species since they had the greatest sample size. We ended with a 4-variable model that included percent boll burn, snag density, tree density in the 12 to 18-inch DBH class, and tree density in the greater than 24-inch DBH class. And here are those 4 variables graphically. So on the left, we have the Arizona myotis, and on the right is the long-legged myotis. The 3 bars that are grouped together correspond to the left axis, and then a single bar on the right corresponds to the right axis. And what we see here is that the Arizona myotis roosted in snags that were overall less burned were in areas with a lower snag density and fewer trees in the smaller DBH class compared to the long-legged myotis. However, the Arizona myotis was roosting in areas with more trees in the larger DBH class compared to the long-legged myotis. Again, here are 2 pictures kind of show those top 4 predictor variables for the Arizona myotis versus the long-legged myotis. So the picture on the left is for the Arizona myotis, and it's generally found in more of a late cereal forest with an open understory and groupings of large trees. It's also roosting in a snag that has very little burn on the boll. Comparatively, the snag on the right, the long-legged myotis, is in a mid-cereal forest with a denser understory, fewer large trees present, and it's also roosting in a snag that's 100% burned. So what does all this mean? So looking back at our first objective, we wanted to assess if wildfire influenced the bat assemblage via bat activity or bat captures. So in terms of bat activity, we found that wing morphology appeared to be driving the response to forest structure, and in our case, in relation to burn severity. Those species that are adapted to high areas of clutter have higher bat activity in the low burn severity areas, which indicates they may be avoiding burned areas. The alternative can be said for those species that are adapted to more open areas, and that they may be favoring areas with high burn severity. However, I would like to point out that we only used a 320-foot buffer for fire severity around these acoustic points, and that's how we categorize the fire severity. So in the future, we'd like to look at larger scales for the acoustic data, which may reveal more patterns at these larger landscape scales that we didn't detect with this very small discrete distance for this analysis. So there may be more going on with fire than we detected. And so because of this, we would predict that the heterogeneity of a wildfire may also play a role in where certain bat species are found. So the rodeo Chetasky fire burned in Arizona in 2002 and burned at a higher severity in larger patches across the landscape compared to the wallow. So the red patches in both of these images are areas of high burn severity. The rodeo Chetasky has over 37% in high burn severity, whereas the wallow only had 9%. So we might expect to see a less diverse bat assemblage in a more homogeneous wildfire compared to the wallow fire that had a variety of burn severities. So in terms of bat captures, we didn't find that the amount of burns surrounding a water site as an important predictor for current capture rate. However, it might be, again, that we need to look at larger scales to see if burn severity is an important predictor. In the 3 previous studies that I mentioned before that were utilizing acoustic, they did show a relationship of bat activity to wildfire. So why is our study different? I would guess that these other studies, they were conducted in a more wet environment, and so it's likely that in these dry environments where water is scarce, the necessity to drink water to replenish energy storage greatly outweighs landscape changes such as the amount of burn severity. And this might be why we also see relative humidity as an important predictor. However, when we do look at the estimating the richness for female species, we found that burn severity was important. And many of these species are known to have high site fidelity to roosting and drinking locations. So again, why did we observe this drop in the estimated species richness from 2 to 3 years post-wildfire? It may be because bats return to known areas in the immediate years, 1 to 2 years post-wildfire, regardless of the abrupt changes caused by these high-severity wildfires. However, 3 or more years post-wildfire, bats may start altering habitat use on the landscape to select sites that are more favorable. So looking back at our second objective, we wanted to assess if wildfire influenced the landscape and microsite level roosting habitat. So neither the amount of burn on the bowl of the roost snag or the amount of burn surrounding a roost snag was an important predictor for roosting habitat. This is likely because we pooled all the bat species together, which masked any species differences. However, when we separated the roost by species, we found that the amount of burn on the bowl of the snag was important, as well as other variables that didn't come out when we pooled all the bat species. So it's important to note that these species differences, that there are differences between species, since management may vary depending on the question as well as the landscape. And the Arizona myotis is likely using larger DBH snags because they have more bark covering the snag and thus can shelter a larger maternity colony. This species can have up to 900 individuals in a roost, so more space is definitely crucial. So finally, based on this study, what are some potential management implications? The current salvage logging guidelines for the Wallow Fire burn area say that all trees greater than 9 inches are eligible. And so based on the maternity roosts we located, we would recommend that managers avoid cutting snags that are greater than 16 inches in diameter and over 59 feet tall. Managers should also harvest from a variety of burn severities and focus in areas with greater than 25% basal area loss. And then lastly, in moderate and high burn severity areas, there's an increase in insects feeding on decaying wood. So managers should avoid high volume salvage logging in these areas as well. In terms of wood cutting permits, the current wood cutting regulations on the Apache Sitgreaves allows 12 to 16-inch DBH maximum, and none of the ranger districts address burn severity that I could find. So we would recommend that the maximum DBH allowed be consistent across all ranger districts at 12 inches, and then also wood cutting permits should be restricted to snags with greater than 25% burn present on the bowl. So although roost snags are important, they are not the sole limiting factor for bats. Commuting and foraging areas are also important, and habitat requirements can be quite different for each bat species. So for this reason, I would recommend that managers spin using uneven age management to allow for a variety of age classes and basal area densities. However, bat communities in the Southwest are very complex, and generalizations across multiple species should be taken with caution. So there are some short and long-term effects that managers should be aware of as well. In the short term, wildfires may not be having a substantial impact. It could even be beneficial for some species. However, in the long term, as these snags fall 10 years post-wildfire, it could take hundreds of years to replace habitat, or it may never be replaced if that vegetation composition shifts due to climate change. So lastly, I would like to just take a quick second to acknowledge all the folks that helped with this project. Our funders were the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, who funded the technicians and equipment, as well as the Macataire Spinis and NAU School of Forestry, who funded me during my master's. We also had 12 technicians that worked their tails off for me over the last 2 years and got very, very little sleep. And then we had over 50 people that volunteered during the 2013 and 2014 bat blitz. And I did provide literature cited, since this will be, from my understanding, posted online. So if you are interested, here's some of the literature. And then with that, thank you for your time. And if there's time, Carol and I can take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. That was a really good presentation. I know myself, I learned a lot about bats, so I appreciate it. And folks online, feel free to type questions in the chat window, and I'm going to unmute the participant line in just a second. So if you'd rather just vocalize your question, you can do that in just a minute. But I'm going to abuse my privilege as moderator and ask about the species you chose. And this obviously shows my ignorance about bats in the Southwest. Are there bats that are under particular stress? Thinking about some of your management recommendations and the sort of differences between bat species, are there some bats that we need to be more worried about protecting or ensuring their habitat is protected than other bats? And would that help understand where to emphasize the management recommendations, or are they all relatively healthy populations, relatively unhealthy?
This is Carol, and I don't know if Erin and I are going to swap off answering questions or not. Erin, did you want to start with this, or do you want me to?
I would say go ahead for now. Yeah. Okay.
So I've looked at the names of who's online, and I know some of you would be interested in the species we chose, particularly the Allen's lappet-browed bat, which is a species people are concerned about. We chose the species we chose. Some of them are quite common, but might be predicted to become uncommon if white nose syndrome hits our state. So the Myota species would be particularly at risk. But those species that we chose are those that tend to use snag roosts as maternity colonies. So we chose them for that reason, because they're good indicators of snag availability in forests. The Allen's lappet-browed bat, we didn't have time to go into detail here, but we did, and also didn't have a huge sample size for those bats. We did capture and radio tag 5 females. And of those 5 females, Erin, you're going to remember better than me, I think 2 went to rock roosts that were quite a bit, like 5 kilometers away. 3 miles, something like that. And then 3 of them we used tree roosts, and I think 2 were in Ponderosa pine, and 1 was in a non-Ponderosa pine.
Fir.
The Douglas fir. The Douglas fir. So we were a little surprised, because one of the snags that this bat used was 100% burned and like 31 centimeters diameter, which I can't translate over to inches, but it's smaller than we expected. We did not find that with the other 2 roosts. They were larger, more typical roosts for that bat species. But that's the species I think that people would be particularly interested in from a standpoint of salvage logging. And given that we did find 1 snag that was burned out of the 3, we have a small sample size, but that would raise some questions about the future salvage logging for that particular species. So did that get at your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and unmute the line now so more expert questions can get asked. Other people on the phone line have questions for Erin or Carol?
I know there are a bunch of batty people on this line.
Well, people are thinking. I'll ask another question, and that is there follow-on work that either of you see as sort of the obvious next step or the crucial next step?
Well, this is Carol, so I'm going to jump in on this again, because this is like my dream project. We have taken a look at immediate post-fire effects on bats, and we're finding short-term no bats seem to be totally horrified. Bats are still on the landscape. They're still using snags. But given some of the other work I've done over the years, I know how quickly these burned snags fall down. Within 10 years, the landscape will be very different. And so I'm very interested in looking across a chronosequence of snags. So we have, or sorry, a chronosequence of fires, where we would look at, you know, a 5-year-old wildfire burned area and a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old and so on, and seeing how the bats are responding to those landscapes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Other questions out there?
No, thank you.
I have a question.
Great.
So certainly fire changes the structure of the forest, but it also has dramatic effects on the insect communities. How might the bats be responding to that as opposed to the structural aspects of the forest?
Hi, Bruce. How are you?
Doing well.
So thanks for coming on today, because I know you were involved in part of the work. We didn't spend time looking at the insect community, so you know, it'd be totally speculating to say that we know how they responded to the fire. That would be another fantastic thing to add into future work to see, you know, are the bats, bats are very mobile and they'll move for insect resources. You know, they seem to be scouting the landscape and adjusting where they roost and move depending on where food is. So I guess I don't know how the insect blooms would change across the landscape. Might dry up more in the high severity burned areas, and so that might be a part of a reason why we're seeing fewer female species in the high burn severity areas. But a lot of that's speculation. Do you have any ideas on that, Bruce?
Just speculations also, but
okay.
Certainly there is dramatic changes to the insect communities that occur following the fire, particularly when you start getting some of your understories starting to come back in, a lot of the herbaceous and shrubs following a fire. I do a lot of insect collections and different things, and you just see a dramatic change. And I don't know how to correlate that to how the bats are interacting, but they certainly are a landscape level species, and they can move a long way to respond to resources.
Yeah, that's the.
Yeah, and I kind of. Oh, can I jump in?
Yeah, who is that? Angie?
No, Valerie.
Valerie, hey.
Hey, yeah, I was going to ask a similar question too. I was kind of thinking of, you know, how black-backed woodpeckers and other species respond to insect eruptions following those types of disturbances, and I was just kind of wondering if there might be that short-term pulse, you know, maybe those 2 years post-fire that might have some effect on kind of what you're seeing in terms of that distribution and diversity.
Yeah, that would be a great. So we're hoping to follow up on this by doing another Bat Blitz next June. You know, we've got 2 years of data, years 2 and 3 post-fire, and that would put us at year 5 post-fire, and we might start to see if that species richness trend is more pronounced. And the point about birds, you know, the response that birds have, we could very well see the same sort of thing as bats. They are more flexible in that they can move their young, which birds can't. So they can follow insects a little bit better.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
Great.
This is Roger Perry. I noticed on your management recommendations you were primarily focused on not cutting trees of particular size. You didn't have anything in there about the presence of exfoliating bark and avoiding those trees. Were most of these roosts under exfoliating bark? And if they were, why isn't that a primary one of your management recommendations as opposed to size of the trees?
We figure if you save it, it will loosen its bark later. So if you're looking at immediate post-fire salvage logging, some of those trees 2 and 3 years after the fire still had pretty tight bark, but they were the right size to slough bark in another 3 to 5 years. And so if we put that recommendation in of only large snags with loose bark, you would be preempting some future habitat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the reason that you can't predict. We were surprised because most of what we see around northern Arizona is use of Ponderosa pine for roost snags. And the bats will roost under exfoliating bark, but they'll also roost in cracks in trees in these snags. It depends on the weather. You know, if you have a colony of 500 bats and it's before monsoon, they want a crack that's more open where there's more airflow. But after the monsoon start, they might want that shelter of the overhanging bark. So they move around quite a bit depending on the weather. But the thing that surprised me was that we found bats over on the Apache Sitka area roosting in species we hadn't seen used before. And our focus was on Ponderosa pine because that was the sample size we had enough of. But Erin, can you list the species? I know there was southwestern white pine that we had bats in, but what other species do you recall?
We had Douglas fir, we had oak, southwestern white pine, and another fir. What was that? White fir? Blanking all of a sudden. I think it was the acronym.
Yeah. So we were surprised at the diversity of tree species used by these bats over on the Apache Sitka. And we're a little higher elevation over there, so you have more opportunities. But in general, I think a lot of these conifers, if the bark is thick enough as they start to decay, they could slough bark and be used by maternity colonies. So we've really focused those recommendations on Ponderosa pine, but you could probably extrapolate it to some other species as well. So does that help, Roger?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Sure. Any other questions? You know, what's our favorite bat, or did we get bitten by rabbit bats, or anything like that, or what does it all mean?
Well, I think the silence suggests that it was a well-done presentation and wrapped up all the loose ends. And so I think what we should do is wrap it up here. And again, thank Erin for a great presentation. And Carol, thanks for your help. And please do join us on future webinars. If you're not getting our mailing emails already, please sign up. And we will send out a recording of this webinar and some follow-up materials as soon as they're available. And when I close out the webinar, you'll get a quick survey, and that just helps us plan webinars that are of interest to you and other activities. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody participating.